I would like to introduce our distinguished guest for the day, Dr. Josef Machach, who was born in Přerov, Czechoslovakia, and lived in Olomouc until 1964, when his family emigrated and settled in the town of Bohemia on Long Island in New York. He received his bachelor and his MD degrees in 75 and 78 from Brown University, and did postgraduate training at the Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, which of course figures in this evening's program. From 1986 until 1995, he headed the stress ECG and nuclear cardiology laboratory at Mount Sinai. In 1992, he became director of nuclear medicine, and in 2003, professor of radiology and medicine. Dr. Machach has authored or co-authored 120 scientific papers in peer-reviewed publications and 18 different book chapters, and he has trained many, many residents and fellows over the years. He retired in July 2016, and for the last 7 years, he's been volunteering part-time as a general internist and cardiologist at the Bergen Volunteer Medical Initiative clinic in Hackensack, New Jersey, for working people who cannot afford health insurance. And there he initiated an obesity treatment program, which now continues with funded support. He has been an active member of the Czechoslovak Society of Arts and Sciences since 1980. And he is really a Renaissance man. His other activities include beekeeping, brewing beer. We hope one day to have another program with him sharing us some of his experience in those areas. Also enjoys travel, reading, folk dancing, yoga, Tai Chi, and other martial arts. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Josef Machach. He has asked me before he goes into his talk to sort of get us into the mood, to set the mood, to share with you a song, a German song performed by the singer Richard Tauber.
Blau ist ein Blümelein, das heißt, vergiss nicht mein. Dies Blümlein leg ans Herz und denk an mich. Stirbt Blum und Hoffnung gleich, wir sind an Liebereich, denn die stirbt nie bei mir, das glaube ich. Wär ich ein Vögelein, wollt ich bald bei dir sein, Scheit, Heik und hab ich nicht, flüg schnell zu dir. Schöss mich ein Jäger tot, fiel ich in deinen Schoß. Wärst du mich trauriger, gern schür mich.
So please take it over, Dr. Machach.
Thank you. Good evening. I would like I would like to thank Miss Susanna Halsey and the New York chapter of the SVU for inviting me to share my presentation with all of you who are listening tonight. Imagine yourself as a young Red Army officer in charge of a platoon of soldiers on April 24, 1945, in the last days of World War II in the Battle of Berlin. Your unit has advanced slowly in house-to-house fighting against the desperate resistance of the remaining German forces. You come upon a large building in a spacious park. You open the door and with your broken German, order everyone inside to come out, hands up. Several hundred men and women file out from the basement shelter. One of them shouts, "Don't shoot, we are Jews." You are skeptical. Over the past year, as you came across scores of German concentration camps, the prison guards would hide their uniforms and masquerade as inmates to escape the wrath of the Russians. These people looked too well fed. Was this another ruse? You reply in broken German, "Nichts Juden, alles Juden kaputt." The spokesperson explained through an interpreter that the building was a hospital, a Jewish hospital, with doctors, nurses, aides, cooks, orderlies, and patients, all 800 of them Jews. And they produced papers to prove it. They pointed to the sign sculpted in stone above the door of the main building, which said Krankenhaus der Jüdischen Gemeinde, which means the hospital of the Jewish community. The officer conducted a search. No hidden weapons, no hidden uniforms. The officer scratched his head. How was it possible for so many Jews to survive right in the heart of Berlin, long after all other Jews in Germany had been deported to concentration camps, where nearly all perished? To understand this astonishing find, we have to go back to the beginning of the Jewish community in Berlin. Records show that Jews inhabited Berlin from the 13th century onwards, with typical alternating cycles every 50 years or so of being invited to settle, followed by persecution and expulsion. The first permanent Jewish settlement of Berlin dates to 1671, when the Grand Elector of Brandenburg offered asylum to 50 Jewish families expelled from Austria. They were allowed to build a synagogue and lay out a cemetery. The task of caring for the sick and assisting the poor, the Hekdesh, was carried out in the synagogue and community houses, along with a Hebrew burial society located along the street pictures in a later photo. With the help of the Society of Patients Visitors, the Hevra Bikur Cholim, a property was purchased and the first Jewish community's hospital was opened in 1756. 4 stories high, 20 windows wide, 12 rooms in the location indicated by the arrow in the picture on the left, modeled after the Charité, the Berlin University Hospital for sick, impoverished Christians, staffed by professors training army doctors and surgeons, that eventually became the Humboldt University Medical School. The famous Sephardic doctor from Portugal, Benjamin de la Mar, became the medical director of the hospital. The Jewish hospital became known as the Little Charité. It received praise for its high medical and culinary standards. Its mortality rate was significantly lower than for the French hospital or even the Charité. Orthodox Jewish community demands that only pious Jewish doctors work there and the Jewish dietary laws be followed were not implemented. The hospital defined itself as an interdenominational institution open to patients and employees of all beliefs. This remarkable development is tied to Moses Mendelssohn, who was a pioneer of the European Jewish Enlightenment movement, the Hashkalah, and Rabbi Abraham Geiger, the founder of Reform Judaism, which initiated the process of assimilation of Jews into Prussian society. Assimilation and conversion to Christianity in the 19th century was common. Reform Judaism was meant to counter this trend. The Protestant church was used as a model. Sermons in German, singing and organ playing. It introduced the bat mitzvah. Women could read the Torah and participate in service. The Jews of Berlin were granted emancipation and full citizenship rights by 1812, inspired by the French Revolution and Napoleon's reforms. Conservative and Orthodox Jews split off in 1869 and continued to follow the Jewish law strictly and founded their own hospital. In 1885, they became an independent religious association. The others formed the Reform movement, alive until 1938. Both Reform Judaism and modern Orthodoxy were exported from Germany to the US and elsewhere. As the Berlin Jewish community grew from 2,800 in 1813 to 65,000 in 1871 and 90,000 2 decades later, the Jewish community built a new, larger hospital in the heart of Berlin in 1861, near where the famous New Synagogue or Neue Synagogue was also built by the same architect. The Jewish hospital moved again to its final location in the working class district Berlin-Wedding, just days before outbreak of World War I. Each move allowing the implementation of the latest up-to-date medical facilities and technology. Besides the Charité, it was the most modern hospital in Berlin, noted for its exemplary treatment as well as trend-setting medical research. Its amenities included hydrotherapy, as well as balconies to allow patients to get fresh air, an important part of treatment for tuberculosis and other respiratory diseases, and a hypobaric chamber. Some of the leading doctors in Germany worked there. Due to its reputation, the number of non-Jews treated at the hospital increased. A nursing school was established. By the turn of the 20th century, the Jewish community was quite integrated into German society and enjoyed an unprecedented confidence in the future. Still, many Jews used the Jewish hospital rather than their local district hospitals due to growing anti-Semitism. Before the 19th century, anti-Judaism was based on religion. In the 19th century, anti-Semitism became based on racial theory. Historian Heinrich von Treitschke, with his theories of history and his interpretation of Darwin's theory of evolution, both of which supported German militaristic chauvinism, made anti-Semitism academically and socially acceptable. One cannot overestimate the impact of public discourse on public opinion, just like historical racism and anti-immigrant bigotry in America and the more recent anti-Latino, anti-Muslim rhetoric during the past 5 years, and the concurrent rise in the number of anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish attacks, and the unconvincing condemnation by the current outgoing president of the anti-Semitic signs and rhetoric in the Charlottesville incident and during the recent mob attack on our national capital. Although relatively few anti-Semitic motivated crimes were committed in Germany at this time compared with Russia or France, anti-Semitism increased in the decades leading up to World War I. After the outbreak of World War I, we see staff members of the Jewish hospital serving on the Eastern Front having a lunch at a Polish farm. I won't comment if the staff helped themselves to some of the animals you see in the foreground. Dr. James Israel, shown below, pioneered and developed a hospital train, a portable hospital on rails. Here we see nurses from the Jewish hospital serving near the front. Dr. James Israel, who was a pioneer in kidney surgery, was so famous that he was called to Constantinople to treat the Turkish Sultan during World War I. 100,000 Jews fought in World War I for Germany. 2,000 were promoted to the rank of officer. Over 2,000 received the Iron Cross, and 12,000 died in combat. The number of Jews enlisting into the German army was far above the average for the rest of the German population, despite accusations of being shirkers and cowardly war deserters. The German military, in fact, conducted an investigation into this matter, the results being completely contrary to expectations arising from the accusations were never officially published. In the closing months of World War I, the German military, exhausted in its last offensive, was collapsing in the face of the Allied counteroffensive. The German military authorities falsely claimed that Germany was winning the war all the way to the end and lied to the German public about Germany's defeat in the war and were complicit in a big lie, the lie of the Dolchstoß, the stab in the back, that Germany would have won had it not been betrayed by a cabal of Jewish bankers and newspapers, communist labor leaders, and liberal Democrats. This myth crippled the post-war German democracy, which was falsely blamed for Germany's defeat. I do not have to belabor the parallels of the Dolchstoß big lie in post-World War I Germany and big lie of today in the United States, the stolen election of 2020. As the Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels stated, a lie repeated 1,000 times becomes the truth. With Germany's defeat in 1918, anti-Semitism reared its ugly head with frequent incidents during the Weimar Republic, even though Jews continued to enjoy full rights as citizens and participated in all levels of society. This latest phase in anti-Semitism was expected to be temporary. Despite financial difficulties, the hospital thrived to become a world-renowned medical facility with close collaboration with the Berlin Charité. A few weeks after the Nazi accession to power in July 1933, the Jewish population was targeted. 80 Jewish doctors were arrested on the pretext of being communist or anarchist, including the head doctor of the Jewish hospital, Professor Hermann Strauss. Jews were excluded from the civil service, which included many doctors working in public institutions and universities. Jewish doctors could no longer be paid for their services by the government-sponsored the government-sponsored health insurance fund, thus losing their livelihood. In October 1938, Jewish doctors throughout Germany lost their license to practice medicine and became so-called Krankenbehandlers, caregivers. This brings to my mind that nowadays American doctors and nurses are designated as mere health providers. As an independent organization, the Jewish hospital remained one of the few places of employment open to highly qualified doctors that have been forced out of other institutions. It became a concentration of medical expertise, which received international attention. As non-Jewish doctors increasingly refused to treat Jewish patients, the number of beds in the Jewish hospital had to be increased. During Kristallnacht in November 1938, the Jewish hospital was spared damage, but some of the doctors were deported to concentration camps as part of the accompanying mass arrests of the targeted victims. The number of patients injured due to attempted suicides markedly increased. By 1938, most of the hospital staff had changed due to emigration or arrest. About half the Jews of Germany emigrated by then. Starting in September 1941, when it became impossible for Jews to leave Germany, Nazi policy shifted from eviction to one of destruction. All Jews had to wear the yellow star, with exceptions made for so-called privileged Jews. That is, Jewish women married to Aryan men and any half-Jews married to Aryan spouses. I regret that it is necessary for me to use the Nazi terms for who was Jewish and who was not, since the Nazi definitions are different from the traditional Jewish definitions. As Joseph Goebbels famously said, we are the ones who determine who is a Jew. Deportation of German Jews to concentration camps started in 1942, including staff doctors and nurses from the hospital, mostly to Theresienstadt or Terezin, but some also directly to Auschwitz. Exempt for the time being were Jews married to Aryans and those who were half Jewish, but who still had to wear the yellow star. Or, exempted or not, faced deportation at any time if they broke any one of the hundreds of rules restricting their lives, or if their Aryan spouse died or divorced them. The staff worked hard to overcome the inherent abnormality of their situation. Doctors and nurses in their starched white uniforms circulated throughout the buildings, ministering to the sick. Patients were admitted and discharged. Operations were performed. Medications were administered. Meals were prepared and served. Clerks and typists kept registers and prepared documents. The details of the institution's daily life were documented with bureaucratic thoroughness. But the staff's freshly laundered and pressed uniforms bore yellow stars. Here are some pictures of the nursing staff, together with Dr. Hans Knopp, a young single doctor who was a favorite among the women nurses. The Jewish hospital was taken over by the Gestapo, subordinated to the section headed by Adolf Eichmann, who personally came to select those sent to concentration camps when the hospital failed to provide enough victims. A prison ward was set up in the hospital for people who were to be deported and fell ill. Much later, at his trial in Jerusalem in 1960, Eichmann tried to portray himself as a mere cog in the impersonal killing machinery of the state, just following orders and not coming into contact with his victims. This is contradicted by testimonies of survivors of the Jewish hospital who recounted that Eichmann would come for an inspection, order all staff to stand in attention, and would himself pick out the staff to be deported. Apparently, he picked on overweight women wearing glasses. This never came up during Eichmann's later trial. These facts argue against the thesis of the banality of evil of Hannah Arendt. Eichmann's work was not merely bureaucratic plotting, it was deeply personal. Some of the patients were behind bars in the prison ward, and when they were discharged, it was into the hands of the Gestapo. As the Gestapo continued to deport hospital personnel, and with a heavy demand for hospital services, meant that everyone had to work long hours and more had to live in the hospital. The hospital was overcrowded, not just with patients, but because every portion of remaining space had been turned into living quarters for staff members. Police and SS men were everywhere. Up until that time, the Jewish community was represented by the Jewish Reichsvereinigung, used to keep track and control the Jewish population. By 1943, all the board members of the Reichsvereinigung were gone, except for one man, Dr. Lustig, who from then on represented all the Jews left in Germany. Dr. Walter Lustig started out as a military surgeon in World War I. He converted to Lutheranism and married an Aryan wife and worked for the Berlin police prior to the Nazi era as a medical advisor. In 1935, fired from his post, Lustig tried to get a job with the Jewish community. After 1938, when he lost his license to practice, he was hired as a healthcare supervisor by the Jewish Reichsvereinigung. In 1943, thanks to his contacts with the police, he was appointed by the Gestapo as chairman and then its sole member, as well as the head of the Jewish hospital, after his predecessor was deported. The staff feared him because he put together the monthly list of deportees, which was constantly demanded by the Gestapo. According to his secretary, Dr. Lustig looked after the interests of the community, and his seemingly overly cordial relationship with the Gestapo allowed him to save the maximum number of people in the hospital itself. He was reported to be cold and inaccessible and was said to have no contact with anybody except young women with whom he had an affair with, and there were many. The greatest risk to a pretty young woman was not of being coerced into sexual relations with Lustig. Rather, it was incurring the jealousy of Lustig's mistress, Ila, who got on the list for deportation. This meant that not only those doctors or nurses whose work was unsatisfactory were selected, but also persons disliked by his mistress. In February 1943, all the remaining Jews in Berlin, and there were 35,000 of them, most of whom were working in munitions factories crucial for the war effort, were rounded up in the so-called Fabrike Aktion, including Jews in mixed marriages. An angry and noisy demonstration of thousands of Aryan wives against the arrest of their Jewish husbands, lasting for several days outside the detention center, resulted in their release, at least for the time being. The rest were deported. Some of those who were spared were obliged to take over the duties in the hospital of those who were deported, but still could be deported at any time. A famous inmate in the hospital was Dr. Ernst Eichengrün, who had invented aspirin while employed by Bayer. He was deported to Terezin in spite of being married to a non-Jewish woman. A month later, the Gestapo arrived at the hospital with several dozen trucks, ready to close the hospital and deport everyone left. But Dr. Lustig was not ready to capitulate yet. He called Eichmann's office, explained what was going on, and handed the telephone to one of the Gestapo men. The trucks drove away empty. One cannot be sure whether the intention of Eichmann's section of the Gestapo was specifically to keep the hospital open, or whether Eichmann simply wanted to assert his bureaucratic primacy over the Jewish institutions that had been placed under his control. The thwarted liquidation was presented by Lustig as evidence of his value to the remaining Jewish community. But it came at a price. The Gestapo came back, and half of the medical personnel, along with a third of the patients, were deported. In mid-April 1945, the shelling of Berlin by the Red Army began. The tough Gestapo men fled the next day, when they saw that all was lost, and the inmates breathed with relief that they would not be massacred by them. And they were able to release the police prisoners. The hospital had to endure the next 14 days without electricity, light, water, or heating, hiding in the basements as bombs, grenades, and machine gun fire made the above ground spaces dangerous. Wounded people from the outside, mostly non-Jews, were brought in for treatment. There were a few brave people who went out and got bread and other groceries to feed the inmates and staff. The 800 inmates and the staff survived intact. It is difficult for us to understand why the Gestapo maintained the Jewish hospital, since they otherwise put to death sick people as quickly as possible. Not only did the inmates survive, but actually received good medical care. For this purpose, the staff was saved to carry on this necessary function. Some staff had non-Jewish spouses, may have been spared deportation for that reason. But there were many other full Jews who had no family relations to non-Jews, who otherwise would have been deported. On the day of liberation, Dr. Lustig disappeared. He was said to have been arrested by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, and executed by a firing squad. On May 6th, the chief rabbi of the Polish army, which arrived together with the Red Army, assembled a group of Jews in the rooms of the Reichsvereinigung to lead a prayer of thanksgiving and a song in memory of the millions of Jews murdered. The pre-war Berlin Jewish population of 186,000 was down to just over 5,000. At the end of the war, there were severe shortages of food and fuel and continued anti-Semitism among the municipal authorities. Bank accounts of surviving Jews and of the Jewish community were still frozen. Despite partial damage from bombing, the hospital continued to function under the direction of Dr. Helmut Cohen, shown in the picture. The presence of international relief organizations ensured that the hospital did not suffer looting and received adequate medicines and supplies. The nursing school was reopened. A few deported staff returned alive from concentration camps, notably the head of pediatrics, Dr. Oskar Rosenberg. By Allied decision, the hospital, the only surviving Jewish institution in Germany, was open to all residents of the district. Some of the staff continued working at the Jewish hospital, while others, like Dr. Helmut Cohen, who led the hospital right after the war, emigrated. The Berlin Jewish community was split into East and West in 1952. The East Berlin community, headed by Rabbi Riesenberger, was small and declined due to old age. The Western Berlin Jewish community, headed by Heinz Galinsky, shown together with the mayor of Berlin, Willy Brandt, at first stagnated, but then grew markedly in the 1990s, mainly due to immigration of Jews from the Soviet Union, so that the present Jewish community is very active and thriving, at least as large as the pre-war community, but the cultural composition and the relationship to the history of the city is quite different. Since the 1970s, the hospital has been reconstructed and expanded, and is a part of the healthcare system of Berlin. It was modernized and provided with up-to-date equipment and new departments to keep up with developments in medicine. The hospital's traditional religious origin is seen in only a few spots, namely the stone carving above the entrance, Krankenhaus der Jüdische Gemeinde, and the occasional mezuzah in a doorway. In 1991, an association, Freunde des Jüdischen Krankenhaus, Friends of the Jewish Hospital, was formed with the aims to maintain art and culture in the hospital, to support projects that protect the history of the hospital from being forgotten. Examples of its accomplishments include a wall exhibit with information on the hospital's history, which formed the basis of the traveling exhibit which came to Mount Sinai Hospital in New York and to my attention. The hospital synagogue was reconstructed and reopened in 2003, with the original Torah and shrine returned to their original place, and some of the street signs were changed to remind people of the origin of the hospital and the Jewish community. Although the story of the Berlin Jewish Hospital has been written about, including a book by Daniel Silver, whose title I borrowed for a part of this presentation, it remains virtually unknown. So why did this remarkable story capture my attention? I have worked at the Mount Sinai Hospital in New York for 38 years, until recently. In August 2007, on walking into the main hospital lobby, I saw an exhibit that had been put up overnight dealing with the story of the Berlin Jewish Hospital. The exhibit, sponsored by the Moses Mendelssohn Institute in Germany, went to Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Haifa, and only one other place, the Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. I learned then that the original Mount Sinai Hospital in New York was in fact modeled on the Berlin Jewish Hospital and was therefore a sister institution. Mrs. Angela Merkel had just become Chancellor of Germany, and her coalition partner, Vice Chancellor Matthias Platzek, a fellow East German and a Social Democratic representative in the Bundestag for Berlin-Brandenburg, was sent a special greeting to Mount Sinai to open the exhibit. Mount Sinai Hospital, originally called the Jews Hospital, was founded in 1852 by a group of prominent Jewish philanthropists, partly representing the original Portuguese Jewish community that emigrated to Dutch New Amsterdam in the early 1650s from Brazil to escape persecution, about the same time as the first permanent Jewish settlement in Berlin, plus more recent Jewish immigrants from Germany and elsewhere in Central Europe following the revolutions of 1848. It was originally located on 28th Street between 7th and 8th Avenues, a 4-story building with 45 beds. Its purpose was to serve poor sick members of the New York Jewish community so that they would not be a burden on the civil authorities and an embarrassment to the Jewish community. The Jewish hospital was initially sectarian, but after the American Civil War, the name was changed to Mount Sinai Hospital and was opened to patients and staff of all faiths. The directors assembled a staff of respected and dedicated doctors and set up training for house staff. Like its Berlin counterpart, the hospital moved several times. It moved in 1872 to 66th Street and Lexington Avenue with 120 beds. That building is no longer there. And in 1904, Mount Sinai moved to its present address on 5th Avenue and 100th Street with 450 beds then, by today grown to 1,000 beds. The buildings in the foreground are still there. In 1885, the first woman doctor to complete her training at Mount Sinai was Dr. Mary Putnam Jacoby. Like the Berlin Jewish Hospital, Mount Sinai became a leader in innovation, including an outpatient department and the first department of pediatrics in the country, just to give a few examples. There was also a keen interest in research and education. In the 1890s, many staff members received training in Europe, especially in Germany. In 1900, the newly invented Röntgen rays were introduced for diagnostic work. New specialty buildings and departments were added. Like the Berlin Jewish Hospital, the Mount Sinai Hospital staffed and ran an army field hospital in World War I in France, although in this case as part of the American Army. Residency positions were very competitive because of its distinguished teaching staff and opportunity for learning, as well as lack of positions for young Jewish doctors at other institutions due to anti-Semitic discrimination. As in Berlin and elsewhere, this led to an extraordinary concentration of bright young talent. In the 1920s, it became a teaching hospital for medical students from Columbia University and started its own medical journal. In the 1930s, Mount Sinai received a large infusion of refugee doctors from Nazi Germany and Austria, many of them former staff members of the Berlin Jewish Hospital. And again, Mount Sinai maintained and staffed a 3,000-bed US hospital during World War II in North Africa, Italy, and then in France. In 1963, Mount Sinai launched its own medical school, headed by Dr. Hans Popper, a world-renowned liver disease specialist and a former refugee from Vienna. Over the years, Mount Sinai was a place of many important discoveries by doctors, many of whom have diseases and procedures named after them, like Tay-Sachs disease, Berger's disease, Crohn's disease, or the Wassermann test. The list is too long for me to share. It's interesting that unlike explorers who have rivers and mountains named after them, or physical scientists who get theories and physical constants named after them, in medicine, if you're famous, your name is borne by some horrible disease or a diagnostic procedures for a disease that until recently could not be discussed in polite company. In 1977, Dr. Solomon Berson and Dr. Rosalind Yallow from Mount Sinai received the Nobel Prize for their invention of the radioimmunoassay, which revolutionized diagnostic medicine. Unfortunately, Dr. Berson died before he could go to Stockholm to claim his prize, so Dr. Yallow accepted the prize by herself. I had a chance to work in the same department as Dr. Yallow did. At the time of my arrival at Mount Sinai in 1978 for residency training, many of my teachers and mentors were either born in Germany or Austria or were descendants of refugees. I learned that even in America in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, Jewish doctors were not welcome in most American training hospitals, and therefore bright, talented doctors, at the time mostly men, could only receive training in the Jewish community-sponsored hospitals. I understood that Mount Sinai was largely a German Jewish institution, while the Russian, Polish, and Sephardic Jews went to Maimonides, Beth Israel, or Montefiore. The German Jews seemed to have brought with them a Germanic sense of cultural and scientific superiority. Because of the fierce competition to secure a medical training, Mount Sinai was an intense place on steroids, like its Berlin model. With my Czech non-Jewish background, I had been cautioned about coming to Mount Sinai for my internship and residency training. But my medical school dean, Dr. Stanley Aronson, may he rest in peace, who spent a number of years at Mount Sinai, assured me that Mount Sinai was a perfect fit for me. I remember very well my first day at Mount Sinai. I was assigned to the emergency room. It was early in the morning. All was quiet. The staff from the night shift had gone home. There were a few patients waiting to be taken upstairs. I was terrified. An older, stern-looking man in a white coat with a stethoscope hanging from his neck walked in, looking around. I stepped forward and asked if he needed any help. He looked at me over for a while and then said, "Young man, I think that you're the one who needs help." I remember that at the weekly medical grand rounds conferences, there were often present the chief editors of no fewer than 4 top American medical journals, all in one room. The heated arguments among them were legendary. The board of directors of the hospital consisted of philanthropists from families like Klingenstein, Annenberg, Guggenheim. The speech of my teachers was peppered with German and Yiddish expressions. The chief of cardiothoracic surgery would frequently say, "Die Methode ist alles." The method is everything. The head of the clinical pathological conference would always ask, "Was ist die Ursache?" What is the ultimate cause? The culture extended to non-Jewish doctors as well, who absorbed the lingo. An outstanding figure was Dr. Jerome Wei, a pioneer in gastrointestinal endoscopy, who was of Chinese background and had married a Jewish woman, who was legendary for his speech and swearing full of Yiddish expressions. There was a degree of Central European formality. One faculty member, after introducing himself to the new cardiology fellow, said, "You can call me by my first name, Doctor." In spite of my initial concerns, I felt welcome. Many senior doctors and patients fondly remembered the pre-war Czechoslovak Republic of Presidents Tomáš Masaryk and Eduard Beneš. I had done nothing to deserve the extension of their fondness for interwar Czechoslovakia to me personally, but who was I to protest? At the same time, they were uniformly disappointed that as a Czech, I did not speak German. All Czechs were supposed to know German, they said. Being a post-World War II baby growing up under Soviet control, I had learned Russian in grade school, and in high school in New York, I studied French. So to get them off my back, I took German lessons at the Goethe House on Fifth Avenue, which resolved the problem. I have to be grateful to them for pushing me to expand my language skills. I too soaked up their culture. Once it was my turn as a faculty member of the cardiology staff, shown here, to teach young trainees. It was my perceived duty, even though I am not Jewish, not only to teach young doctors coming from Asia and Latin America medicine, but also to help them survive and teach them such Yiddish terms.
There.
Can you turn off your audio, please? Thank you. But also I help them survive and teach them such Yiddish terms like schmutz for any indistinct finding on X-ray films, a schmeckel for anything on images that sticks out, shtick for one's chief interest, meshuga, chutzpah, mensch, the crucial difference between a shlomazel and a shlomil, and taught them what it means to kibitz, kvetch, schlep, pachki around, schmooze, or daven. And then I had to teach them the intricacies of Jewish dietary laws observed by our ultra-Orthodox patients from Brooklyn when we prescribed special diets. Simply, the ganze Megillah. So when the exhibit on the Berlin Jewish Hospital came to Mount Sinai one day in August in 2007, it was as if a whole circle had been completed. It also happened that the same week, one of my former students, a visiting young doctor from the Charité of Humboldt University in Berlin, who had rotated through the Berlin Jewish Hospital during her training, who did her PhD thesis at Mount Sinai under my supervision just happened to visit us that same week, who was now an accomplished doctor at the Charité with a teenage son in tow. It also hit me then that the culture of Mount Sinai had changed. It had become much more diverse, which was good, but the German Jewish culture had almost vanished, which was sad. The previously plentiful German or Jewish expressions were gone from everyday use. The symbols used for Mount Sinai Hospital had been changed. None of the house staff had a clue who Hans Popper, Wasserman, or Burson and Yellow were, famous medical pioneers whose names had adorned our clinical pavilions, to be gradually replaced by names of current Wall Street tycoons. By this time, most of my senior teachers were no longer around. Global changes were happening in medicine, whereas the chief focus of activity for my colleagues and I was high quality and excellence of patient care and academic achievement with a large degree of autonomy for creativity and innovation. It was by this time that intense economic pressures were at work, forcing us to curtail any activities that did not bring the hospital revenue, which was heartbreaking, and to aggressively promote such activities and procedures that were sources of revenue. For some time by then, all the metropolitan medical institutions were in an arms race of network empire building. The faculty dining room used to have tablecloths, real silverware, and flowers. Now the overcrowded cafeteria was more egalitarian, with everyone, staff, visitors, and ambulatory patients all packed together with no opportunity to casually connect with colleagues. I stopped eating there and preferred to have lunch in my office. Young 30-year or something junior house staff addressed senior faculty and elderly patients by their first name when first meeting them for the first time. In medicine, we're used to living with danger. Patients do die eventually, but we, health professionals, can cause suffering and even death through mistakes or insufficient training. A significant mistake was met when I was in training with harsh rebuke. I never forgot those lessons, although it did not feel good at the time. More recently, as supervising health providers, we were not allowed to discipline or rebuke our trainees to avoid lowering their self-esteem and get slammed during reviews. Everybody now was above average and was doing a fantastic job, no matter how much they messed up. At the same time, the supervising senior staff members were responsible for all the outcomes of other people's mistakes, and in our litigious environment, you got nailed at the drop of a hat. Even though I still had 9 more highly productive years ahead of me at Mount Sinai, I knew then that eventually I would have to part ways with it, a process which was brought to completion nearly 4 years ago. So when I learned about the story of the Berlin Jewish Hospital juxtaposed with the story of Mount Sinai Hospital, I was feeling a sense of sadness for both. In spite of the obvious geographical and historical differences between them, the grand arc of development of these institutions from their sectarian origins through their use to prominence serving their particular communities into modern times, and their continued serving the needs of the broader community today are remarkably similar. When I put together this presentation, it was my Schwanlied or swan song to Mount Sinai. So why talk about it? First, because the parallel stories of the Berlin Jewish Hospital and Mount Sinai Hospital in New York that connected in my mind will gradually fade from memory now that I'm no longer there. Second, as the late Elie Wiesel used to say, if we want to give meaning to the lives, sacrifices, and suffering of the victims of the Holocaust and World War II, and to all the efforts and struggles expended to build these institutions and communities that preceded us, we need to remember and be reminded of them and continue to draw lessons from that experience. That there is a continued need to draw lessons is clearly evident in our present time. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak to you and to your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Machač, for this really inspiring talk that brings together history, pretty deep Central European history, and then your own personal experience. You've preempted my first question that I was forming while you were talking, which was what brought you to this topic, and you referred to this exhibition that came to the hospital in 2007. But you also alluded to, your awareness of a German Jewish culture at Mount Sinai before that. So I was wondering if you had if you had begun to build any knowledge of the Berlin Jewish Hospital prior to that exhibition in 2007. Had you heard anecdotes or stories about it that had begun to pique your curiosity even before that exhibition came? And just before you answer, I would like to encourage all of our audience to go ahead and submit questions for Dr. Machač to the chat, and I'll try and field those as well as I can coming in.
Thank you. Before I saw the exhibit coming to Mount Sinai, I had absolutely no knowledge or anything about the Berlin Jewish Hospital and about its remarkable story, nor did anybody else at Mount Sinai to whom I had talked, although there were, I'm sure, quite a number of people who were aware of it, including the Dean of Medical Education, who I believe was instrumental in arranging for the hospital to be brought to Mount Sinai.
I see. Wonderful. Well, there's a lot coming into the chat. It is mostly by way of comments, with a lot of well-deserved praise for your talk, a lot of appreciation for it, and a lot of praise here. Wonderful chronological history, wonderful job, an excellent lecture. Dr. Machač, we'll have to save this whole chat so you can appreciate this later. Also, here's a question. Were all the German Jewish doctors seen on the pictures in the video around 1945 working in the hospital in Berlin, or were they elsewhere?
The only picture from 1945 that I shown was that with Dr. Helmut Cohen, who was the chief of the Jewish hospital at the end of World War II. There was, I believe, a nurse, but all the other persons were members of the Allied command. You can notice that they were in military uniforms. One was in American uniform and the other was a French uniformed officer. So there was just one doctor and one nurse from the hospital in their only picture from 1945.
Wonderful. So I think there's a question probably came in from someone who missed the introduction and asked, where is the speaker currently working? Would you like to just say a little bit about your current work?
I am working as a volunteer twice a week at the Bergen Volunteer Medical Initiative, BVMI, which is located on 75 Essex Street in Hackensack. It is currently closed due to the COVID pandemic, except for a few staff who are manning the phones to take care of these. But the other volunteer nurses and doctors and many other support staff work remotely. So I twice a week, I see patients by telemedicine. Before the pandemic, I was volunteering 1 day a week at this clinic. This organization, or under its initials BVMI, is entirely supported by donations and the time of some 45 volunteer nurses, doctors, and other technicians and support staff. So they are actually well represented in our community. So I would encourage all of you who can to send the donations to BVMI that you can see on the, if you just search for it on the website, to support this really noble effort. And it has been really heart-rendering to see the suffering of people who are at a very low income level, who have either lost their jobs and do not have a means of economic support, many of whom did not qualify for the support from the government. And those who are working are, of course, exposed more than the rest of us to the dangers of infection by COVID. And indeed, it has been heartbreaking to see the suffering from the COVID pandemic with such a high prevalence in this population, most of whom are of a Latino origin.
A couple of questions that came up on your historical topic. Going back to Berlin's hospital in the years 1941 to 1945, there was probably a scarcity of medical supplies. Do you know how it was managed? Do you have any knowledge about who funded the hospital at that time?
As I mentioned, the hospital was taken over by the Gestapo and was run by, and therefore by the German government. It's quite amazing that actually the hospital was very well supplied with both food and medical supplies. It is really bizarre considering that somebody who was destined to be deported to the concentration camp will be so well fed and taken care of just prior to their release and being sent to be murdered, in Auschwitz. So it's one of these bizarre thought processes of the Nazi government, but probably it was due to the bureaucratic thought processes of the German government.
Another question, do you know if anyone tried to defend Dr. Lustig from being persecuted and ultimately killed by the Russians?
I don't think that there was any chance for that kind of discussion because as soon as the war ended, as soon as the Red Army came, he simply disappeared, and it's only by rumor that he was grabbed by the Soviet secret police. So I'm sure there was no discussion of any defense or etc. So we can only assume that he was summarily executed on the basis of his reputation.
So there's an interesting comment from someone who did research on the history of the Department of Biochemistry at Istanbul Medical Faculty in the years 33 to 57. And there were 3 German scientists, Werner Lipschitz, Felix Hauerwitz, and Zdenko Stary. So he recommends that. Here's another question. Were there doctors from the Jewish hospital who immigrated to the US and who have descendants who know their stories?
Absolutely. Those doctors who were able to emigrate from the Berlin Jewish Hospital did wind up in the United States. They were, of course, distributed all over. Some actually came even to Mount Sinai, but unfortunately, I did not meet or know of specifically about the identity of any of these. That would require further research. I'm sure it will be possible to track them down.
So I'd like to thank Dr. Machach once again for a remarkable talk, which so many of our audience have commented on, that really was incredibly powerful for the combination of the historical theme and then your own personal experience. So thank you so much. If there was anyone who had a question that I somehow missed or that you were not able to get, you can send it to us at SVU, and we will try and pass it along to Dr. Machach for follow-up. And again, thank you so much to our audience for joining us tonight. And we look forward to welcoming you to future events at SVU, the Czechoslovak Society of Arts and Sciences, and also our co-sponsor for this evening's program, the Society for History of Czechoslovak Jews. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you and good night.